Hi, it's me, Edward O'Neill, and I'm welcoming you back to week 4 of the Science of Learning. This week, you're going to learn about specific concepts within learning science. These are research-based concepts, and I like to think of these as smaller than a theory. A theory is a big idea, and a research-based concept is something more narrow and testable. If you think about the engine that's inside your car, for instance, it has different systems inside it that make it work. The pistons work one way, and the transmission works another way, and the exhaust system works another way, and the steering system works another way, and the brakes, etc. That is, it's one large system, but it has a whole bunch of subsystems. So there are a lot of places in your car, if you own one, where things could go wrong. So a theory of learning is kind of like a theory about the whole engine and how it works and what it does. And the learning science concepts oftentimes are about specific kind of subsystems or elements of the whole process. So the other thing you're going to do this week is work more on evidence. How do you gather evidence to understand a learning problem that you want to solve? Last week you worked on interviewing on observation. This week you're going to work on gathering information and analyzing it and even visualizing it so you can understand the problem better. And next week you'll explore reviewing the literature to develop a testable hypothesis. So we can explore some of these science research-based learning concepts by applying them to a particular example, because you will need to do that. So let's say you're working with the state. They are training people who are collecting unemployment with interview skills because their hypothesis is that will help them get a job faster, something measurable. So one research concept is practice and feedback. How are the learners going to practice? You could interview them, they could interview each other. When you study what you're doing, how are you going to determine that the interviewing training you did actually made a difference? You can't ethically deprive people of training that's potentially positive, and so you could have to find some other way of doing that. You might compare people who are not yet trained to people who are already trained, where everyone's going to get the training. It's a waiting list method that researchers used. Someone isn't getting the treatment, but they're on the wait list, so they're more or less the same population. You may want to figure out if you're teaching interviewing skills, for instance, because learning skills is a different process than learning concepts. When people start learning a skill, they start off in a very uncoordinated way. They need to be guided kind of step by step. And then the highest level of skill performance is you can adapt to a new situation. So you might decide that in this kind of instruction, you want to help people learn a skill, and maybe the highest level is adapting an interviewing skill to other places and other formats, or maybe that's another form of practice. I remember I had a career counselor once who taught me an interviewing technique, the STAR technique: situation, task, action, result. So when you're talking in an interview, you use this technique, and it becomes a skill when you're good at it, of saying it, well, there was this situation, and I was supposed to do this task, and this is the action that I took, and this is the results that I got. You could be practicing that for an interview, but if you were practicing the skill and adapting it, you might try it in your resume. You might try it in your job letter. If you are looking at the learning concepts of motivation, two of the important kinds of motivation are extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic is some external material rewards, not a pat on the head. It could be money, for instance, is a classic extrinsic reward. Intrinsic is because it matters to you. It's something that you care about. So everyone looking for a job presumably has extrinsic motivation. Some might have more intrinsic motivation, or you might design learning to highlight the intrinsic motivation, self-fulfillment of doing something that you care about. How would you gather information about that? What kind of facts would you gather about that? You could find a survey instrument that helped you understand people's motivation, whether it was extrinsic or intrinsic. And you could survey the people in the program and then look at the results and see if People with more intrinsic motivation were more likely to get a job after the interviewing training. So it's not just the interviewing training, but their motivation. Another research concept is goal orientation. Are you oriented towards a specific result or simply towards improving? And researchers are unsure if this is what they call a state or a trait. That is, are some people oriented towards a goal versus improvement in one situation and another orientation in a different situation? So you might want to find out about the people who are getting the interviewing skills training. What kind of goal orientation do they have? Can you structure the training so that they're oriented simply towards improving? Does that improve the learning outcome in terms of them being able to demonstrate the skills? And does it actually help them get a job more quickly? Another learning concept is working memory and cognitive load. How much information can you store in your mind at one moment? A kind of classic way of testing this is reading off a string of digits to someone and having them repeat them to you, sometimes in reverse order, because that's a little harder. At what level do people choke when they're trying to repeat these digits that are just being held in the mind for a moment? Working memory tends to correlate with intelligence, because if you have more working memory, it allows you to do more. It's like having a bigger piece of paper to write on, so to speak. So working memory might not particularly be something that you could control, because people have limits on working memory. You could make the instruction so it was more efficient in using working memory, but it's unlikely that you would measure working memory and then see if that made a difference in terms of the results of the program. For problem solving and expertise, that's something that's been well studied in cognitive psychology. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that expert problem solvers tend to spend more time setting up their problem and checking their work. And if you're training people on a skill, you might want to train them to act more like an expert. And you might measure at the end of the training, see who spends more time, planning their responses to interview questions and who spends less. And does that make a difference in the results? So learning science is not just something obscure that happens in laboratories. It's something you can actually use. You're not going to do basic research yourself, most likely. But you can use learning science to form a hypothesis that has more scientific support, and then you can act a little like a scientist in trying to collect evidence to make sure that the hypothesis you had about what would make learning happen more is it intrinsic motivation? Is it a improvement, goal orientation? You can actually try and collect evidence to determine that really did the trick. And that's what you want. You want to make sure not just that you're right, but that people are really learning because of the advice you give.